I am Carol Turner. I'm the chair of London CND, and I'm just taking a moment or two to welcome you all to the meeting. We've got 60 odd people have joined so far, 70 odd people have joined so far, and we'll be having some more as we go along. We're going to be recording the proceedings. I hope that our tech expert Daniel is doing that right now. And we're also going to be streaming on YouTube. Our first speaker, our keynote speaker, is Belle Ribeiro Addy, MP. I'm sure she's known to most of us. She's a very prominent spokesperson in Parliament for nuclear disarmament, as well as a number of other issues. And I'm inviting Belle to speak now on the relationship between war and racism. Thank you for joining us, Belle. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol, and hello to you all. I would wish you Happy New Year, but I'm worried I might jinx it further because it's been a pretty worrying start to 2026, to say the least. Might is right, has been this unspoken mantra of the US imperialism. If we look at Davos this week, it was on everyone's lips. The United States attack on Venezuela and the kidnap of its president was a flagrant violation of international law. And this needs to be understood not as an isolated incident, but as an emerging pattern of behaviour, undermining multilateralism and diplomacy. The confirmed membership of Trump's new peace board is like a meeting of the Death Star staff, a roll call of war criminals, tyrants, and human rights abusers. And it's a blatant attempt to undermine international norms, multilateral diplomacy, and the UN. We are living through a pretty seismic shift in geopolitics. In the moment, it's very hard to see exactly where it all leads. Are we looking at the collapse of American empire or a reassertion of it? What's clear, however, is that we are entering an era of a more overt imperialism around the world, and it's important to acknowledge the difficulty of this current moment for us as anti-nuclear activists. Any strategy looking forward must reckon with the reality that global instability and the reassertion of hard power are not easy situations for those of us advocating for disarmament. But it's important to recognise that we have been proven right in important ways too. Some of us have long pointed out that vying to be America's lieutenant in Europe is not the pathway to security, let alone prosperity. In a world rushing to arms, there is an understandable fear of what might happen to those of us who are left out or left behind. And I'm reminded of a comment by the neoliberal economist Milton Friedman, who said that when a crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And what's going on here is the unspoken logic of competition that underlies neoliberal capitalism, and that's kill or be killed. It's an emergency kind of logic that seeks to suspend all critical thought on an issue. Laying down our weapons, in some's view, would be suicide. And I think there's a danger in becoming benumbed to all of this, succumbing to that emergency logic, because the reality of the situation is very different. You often hear politicians refer to Trident as our independent nuclear deterrent. It's neither of those things, as you well know. It doesn't shoot down an incoming nuke, and it's structurally dependent on the US. The delivery missiles are leased from the US, and it's hard to substantiate rumours of a kill switch, but you don't have to be a genius to consider that it might be a genuine possibility. Wouldn't you do that in the US's situation? This fallacy will become increasingly clear with America First Republicans in the White House, whether it's Trump, Vance, or whatever right-wing lunatic the GOP faithfully hurl into the White House next. And did you see how right-wing Twitter reacted to Trump's pledge to annex Greenland? A substrate of right-wing Twitter and at least one Daily Mail hack were going into spasms of ecstasy and calling for him to do the same to the UK. And it annoys me how poor the right's grasp of the history of the so-called special relationship actually is. You don't have to look back to the American Revolutionary War to see things can change very easily. Look no further than the history of the USA's initial attitude towards the UK's acquisition of nuclear capabilities. There will be a time when our interests diverge, and recent events show that we really do need to rethink our relationship with the USA. Fortunately, Twitter is not real life, and more people can see the reality that is a very one sided relationship and not in the way Donald Trump thinks it is. I wish more journalists would pose the serious question too of whether holding US nuclear weapons on UK soil as we do now actually makes us safer. To my mind, it's always been this base of an excellent target for a preemptive strike. I think about the paradox that the same government that laid the foundations of Britain as a modern welfare state, council homes, the NHS, social security, comprehensive education, also found its way to lay the foundations of Britain as a nuclear armed state. That transformative 1945 Labour government gave our country both the National Health Service and the atom bomb. And it was one politician who said, we've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. Some things never change. In the recent past, Western politicians talked of nuclear weapons in defensive terms, particularly in the context of the prospect of Russian aggression. And I don't think we should be flippant about the threat posed by Russia, even if I'm personally more worried about the military, economic, and political leverage wielded by the USA. But as I've just said, having our own nuclear weapons will not stop a Russian bomb falling on our heads. For me, the pathway to British security in a more multipolar world is through disarmament, diplomacy, and demilitarisation abroad. And shoring up society at home through things like stable public services, energy independence, and industrial strategy. Of course, rearmament is not just a strategic dead end, but a moral one, a criminal misallocation of resources that will always damage global health, ecology, and humanity. Today's politicians have been less honest about the leverage that they offer. And although Trump and Putin are in the driving seat, that at the moment is changing. Maybe that's one of the things currently coming to the fore as the great powers flex their muscles. Even in Britain, nuclear weapons were part and parcel of the post-war consensus, a price we paid to secure our status in the world, even as empire was falling. The winds of change were blowing and national independence movements were winning the day. Among other things, it meant a permanent place on the UN Security Council. In the current climate of renewed fear about rearmament and the imminent use of nuclear weapons, it's harder to envisage the slow violence inflicted by their mere existence. But Black activists have long sought to raise awareness of the direct link between those who possess nuclear weapons and those who colonised Africa and Asia. You only have to look to the history of their use, testing, and possession to see this. The entire history of nuclear weapons is a history of asymmetric power, double standards, and inequality. Nuclear powers became nuclear powers because of their preeminent imperialist credentials. They tested their weapons in dependent territories and colonies inhabited by disenfranchised communities and indigenous peoples. Britain on the inhabitants of Marilinga, Kiribati, and the Montebello Islands, the US on the Marshall Islands, New Mexico, and Nevada, France on Algeria and French Polynesia, Russia on Kazakhstan, and China too. These areas were designed as sacrifice zones by politicians in the imperial core, viewed as terra nullius. The people living here suffered devastating humanitarian health consequences as a result. Children in these communities suffered congenital abnormalities as a result, and the materials used in the bombs were frequently extracted by indigenous communities from colonized countries who lived with the consequences of exposure from uranium mining. From their very inception, nuclear weapons have been a crucial pillar of imperialism and racism, whose mere existence perpetuates harm against global majority communities. One thing I can confidently predict about the immediate future is that they will continue to be wielded in this exact way. At its core, the struggle to dismantle nuclear weapons is an internationalist, anti-racist struggle. And we must be centre and pay tribute to the efforts of these same affected communities at the forefront of anti-nuclear struggles. It was Martin Luther King Jr. that said, "What will be the ultimate value of having established social justice in a context where all people, Negro and white, are merely free to face destruction by atomic war?" We can't build meaningful and lasting security for the many on the promise of mass destruction wielded by the few. And we have to be clear about the unconscionable harm that nuclear weapons would inflict and the unconscionable harm inflicted before a single ICBM is fired in conflict. This argument is even harder to make in the current climate where everything seems to point towards rearmament. But as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So now more than ever, we must question and be ready to speak out about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And we need to keep coming together to make the case for disarmament, diplomacy, and multilateralism. In the face of an escalating sense of nuclear tensions, we have to keep applying pressure, building bridges, and keep fighting for a world that is free from the danger of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belle. We're off to a really strong start. I think you'll agree with me. Before I hand over to Sally Spears, a London CND Vice Chair, who's going to chair the first panel, I just want to make apologies from Mark Howell, who's listed as introducing Belle. He's from Lambeth and Southwark CND, that's right in the heart of Belle's own territory, and she's been absolutely terrific in supporting the activities of the local CND group. So thank you very much, Belle. Thank you for coming. Thank you for a really powerful speech. And thank you for all the work you've been doing behind the scenes and in front of the camera on behalf of CND. I'm now going to hand over to Sally Spears. Are you with us, Sally?
I am.
Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many people on the call. My name's Sally Spears. I'm one of the vice chairs of London CND, and I'm also a co-founder member of CND's newest group, London CND and I think National CND. We're in Finchley in North London. And just to say a quick few words about ourselves, we've had a great year. We formed ourselves a year ago. In that time, we've packed out our local cinema with about 180 people. We've had a screening and speeches. We've tripled the number of people going up to Lakenheath for the demonstrations there. We've spoken to pupils in a local local secondary school. We attracted about a crowd of about 25 people singing outside our local supermarket just before Christmas. We've recruited new and active members, and we're now planning our next action, which is to try and build support to get our council to sign up to the ICANN City Pledge. And if you are in London and thinking about forming a new group, get in touch. And I'd say to you, just go for it, because it's been a very uplifting and wonderful experience. So to introduce the panel, we've got a formidable group of people here. They're veteran campaigners, many of them, opposing war, nuclear weapons, particularly American nuclear weapons, in different ways and different arenas. I think what you're going to hear here is analysis, perseverance, determination, creativity, collaboration, all the qualities that we need in the fight at the moment, in what can appear to people to be very dark days. I'm really excited to introduce them. Welcome to our panelists, and thanks for joining the conference. I'm going to take the speakers in alphabetical order, and if everyone sticks to time, we should have time for a few questions at the end. The order that we'll take them in is Joanna Fitzpatrick from the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace, Jenny Jones, if she's managed to join the call, from the Green Party, Jinsella Kenaway from Demilitarised Education, Melissa Park from ICANN, and Tom Unterreiner, the chair of CND. So I'll introduce each speaker as we go along, and I'm going to start with Joanne. So Joanne is a member of the core group of the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace. She's a regular participant in actions at Lakenheath Air Base, She's active in her local CND group and Ely Peace and Freedom. Joanne also takes part in her local Stand Up to Racism and Women Against the Far Right activities. And she's going to talk to us about the struggle to resist US nuclear weapons in Britain. Over to you, please, Joanne.
Hello, nice to meet everybody, see everybody. So I'm a member of the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace core group. I'm going to refer to it as LAP from now on, if people don't mind. There's about 12 of us, and we sort of organise various things. So LAP was started in 2024, and our main aims are to campaign for peace against nuclear weapons, militarisation and war. And LAP at the moment consists of about 63 organisations, so we are an alliance obviously, and about 500 plus individuals. I'm going to do lots of shameless plugging, but to start off with, if your group or you as an individual would like to join us, then please see our website and there's a sign up form there. So we're dedicated to opposing the return of the nuclear weapons via non-violent direct action. And I'm just going to say a little bit about Lakenheath. So that is our main focus. I live just up the road from it, about 40 minutes away. Lakenheath hosts, although it's said to be a UK airbase, it isn't. It's a US airbase. It houses F-35s, which are American military planes. They've been involved in lots of things. They've been involved in Gaza by supporting Israel. They've also been involved in other conflicts in the Middle East. And in fact, a few days ago, there was an awful lot of planes flying over, and that was thought to be possibly an attack on Iran. So the nuclear weapons are there. We know they're there. They flew over in the summer. These are what the Americans would call smaller nuclear weapons. So they're to be used on battlefields, but not against people. But this does make the area a target, and it's not just this area, it's the whole of the UK, and in fact the whole of the world. The UK government has absolutely no control over it. It's not covered by UK legislation, so if there's a nuclear accident, which there have been a couple in the past, the Americans don't have to do anything about protecting local people, so they work completely outside the UK law and international law. So that's a bit about Lakenheath. We also have Marham just up the road, which is where Keir Starmer's got his shiny new F-35s that he's taken all the money away from public services for. So we're in an area where there's a lot of action going on. So Lakenheath Alliance for Peace was started in 2004. And there are several things that we do. So one of them is around raising awareness. So that's why we have been invited today to speak to you all. We also do, we've been invited to be in quite a lot of meetings sort of across the UK. What I should say is the allied organisations are local, national, international, lots of different types of groups. Again, you can find all that on our website. So we do the raising awareness, and actually at the moment, as has already been said, this is very much in the public domain, and people all of a sudden are sort of like, oh dear, you know, what's going on with Trump and all of that. So we need to sort of just kind of grasp that a little bit. So the other thing we do is we hold vigils at the gate on the third Saturday of every month from 12 till 2. We sit up there, we put all our banners up there, and we stand on the side of the road and wave at people. And some people are hoot their horns, other ones tend to insult us out of the windows of their car. But it's worth doing because that is, we are there and we are a presence there. We've also started inviting other groups to come along and sort of kind of head up the vigils, I suppose. And we've got a group from Wales coming in June with all sort of Welsh activists. And of course, everybody's welcome, but it's just that sort of focus. And we did one in November, which was welfare, not warfare, again, about, you know, what is all of this going on? And really it should be supporting you know, much better things in life. So we do that. We also have a peace camp once a year. And this year's runs from the 1st till the 6th of April. There will be, we're just sort of still sort of organising it all, but each day will be themed. The Saturday, the 4th, will be quite a big event. And I know that London CND have got coaches coming up, which is excellent. So that will be probably the biggest day, but there will be various themed days, you know, and workshops. And we did stuff last year around art and singing and music. And not only that, but we're all around people who are there for the same reason. And actually there's something very strong about that solidarity, you know, and sometimes we can feel quite alone sometimes in what we're doing. Actually, we're not, you know, and there's a lot of people around. Oh, sorry, I'm being told to shut up.
Yeah,
Anyone who knows me knows that.
1 minute.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, please do come and join us. There'll be camping, there'll be catering. Again, sign up form on the website. And also there's a video from last year showing what we've done. And we must increase this activism. You know, we need to get this in the public domain and get it out there. And I'll probably finish now. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Why anybody at the moment would think that America is a reliable enough ally to actually have their troops and their weapons on our soil, I don't know. But fight the good fight, and well done to you at Lakenheath. Our second speaker on this panel is Jenny Jones. I know she wasn't here earlier, so let's hope that she's here now. Jenny is going to talk to us about the right to protest. Jenny's a member of the Green Party. She was a member of the Greater London Assembly, Deputy Mayor of London from 2003 to 4. She's currently one of just 2 Green Party representatives in the House of Lords, where if you look at her website, she's got a number of priorities, but one of them is civil liberties. And that's what she's going to be talking about. She is also known as Baroness Jones of Moulscombe. And if you happen to know Brighton, you may well know that Moulscombe is the housing estate, I think to the north of it, where she grew up. So we're delighted to have you, Jenny, and looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Sally. And I totally agree with Joanne that getting together and joining with people who've got the same motivation and the same feelings about things is incredibly important. And it's why I do still go on protests. My first protest ever was a CND protest in London in 1968. And it was such good fun that I've been to, well, no, probably not hundreds, but dozens of protests since. Now, I'm going to talk about the right to protest, but I would like a short rant about Trump and our so-called independent nuclear deterrent, because I started the speech by writing, there is no independent nuclear deterrent. It's the most expensive lie in British politics. And then I thought, before I actually say that, I really ought to check. So I went to the House of Lords, where we've got experts on absolutely everything. And I asked nuclear people and I asked military people. And the nuclear people said, no, we have not got an independent nuclear deterrent. It can be over, all the software is American. The missiles go to America for updating, and we don't have full control. And also, of course, there's the satellites and so on. And then I went to the military people, and they said, "Oh no, we have absolute control. It's our finger on the button. We decide." And having listened to several people on both sides, and they were very keen to debate this particular point, I thought to myself, I just don't believe that we have control. So I'm going back to my original opening, that we don't have an independent nuclear deterrent. Now, having so much reliance on American software and logistics hasn't really been incredibly important to politicians for the last 30 years, but now it clearly is, because there's absolutely no logic in keeping a deterrent if Trump has and his allies have some sort of control over it, because he only cares about America first and raw power, and he doesn't believe in the UN or rules or stability. I'm not big on rules myself, but I do like stability. And of course, he's not ruled out military action in Greenland. He's talking constantly about big tariffs and so on. He is a bully, and the way to deal with bullies is not to constantly back down. What we have to do is stand up to them. And quite honestly, we have far too many American bases here in Britain, and we should be thinking about removing them in some way. 80% of our arms expenditure goes towards US-based companies. That really has to stop. And I would say that removing Trident and our entanglement with America is the best way of going forward, because we need a partner that we can trust. And Europe and other international allies will be the people that we have to turn to. We definitely need a review of all the bases, all the American bases in the UK. And I think they've got to go. Now, I was signed up to talk about the right to protest, and this is a very, very tricky area at the moment, because there has been so much anti-protest law passed into legislation over the past few years that it's really quite shocking, and protest is becoming harder and harder without breaking the law. There's also the fact that when you have this much law, sort of legislation on top of legislation, what happens is the police get very confused. And the police have made some real blunders in the arrests that they've made and the sort of reaction that they've had to protests. And some of the protest law has been it's been written so badly that it's been laughed at by the House of Lords. I don't know if people understand that legislation gets pushed quite quickly through the Commons, because the MPs, first of all, don't have time most of them don't have time to look at legislation very closely. And of course, most of them are whipped. So they just do what they're told. But when it comes to the House of Lords, we actually do read the bills. We read the legislation line by line, and we try to help the government. We try to cooperate by improving it and actually making it, sometimes we have to make it legal, because some of the stuff they try to pass is illegal. But then the problem is the government starts to insist, and the Tory government and the current Labour government have insisted on some quite bad law. And what they constantly do in the House is they start saying, well, it's over to the police will implement this, you've got to trust the police, and so on. And of course, if you create bad law, you are asking the police to make mistakes. You are giving them, a flawed system to work with. And in fact, senior police officers are now saying, we actually need to simplify the law. It's got too complicated. In one bill that the Tories tried to push through, it said that it was all right to make a noise at a protest if you were going past a double glazed building. And what? I mean, utterly ludicrous. And so we have got on the statute books some of the most repressive protest laws. And it strikes me that the police are being set up to fail. I'm not saying the police are faultless, they most definitely aren't. But when you have so much legislation, it's very, very hard for them to judge what is the right response. And so we saw it very much so with Palestine Action, and the fact that once it had been prescribed, the police were arresting a lot of people who said things like, I support Plasticine Action, and things like that. And so protest is becoming harder and harder. And I would argue that's even more of a reason to get out there and protest. I've only been arrested once. It was a very unpleasant experience. I didn't get thrown into a cell. In fact, I was de-arrested after 3 minutes. And I think that people who do get arrested, who know they're going to get arrested and thrown into a cell, are extremely brave. I don't want to get arrested again, but it's definitely not going to stop me getting out and protesting. And I look forward to the next CND protest, and I will try my best to be there. Thank you for listening.
That was amazing timing, Jenny. Well done. Amazing
Stopwatch.
timing, Jenny. Oh, yeah, well done. Right, so we're going to our third speaker now, who is Ginsella Kenaway. I've heard Ginsella speak because she's a very lively, fantastic speaker. She's also co-founder and CEO of Demilitarized Education. She's passionate about harnessing education for peace. She studied at Manchester Uni and she was involved in civil rights and social action. She set up and chaired the campaign against Arms Trade Society at Manchester Uni to investigate UK universities' involvement in the arms trade. So, Ginsella, welcome to the panel, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you to all the speakers who have gone before me. It's really incredible to get our voices together and piece together the puzzle, which is the disarmament movement. Like Jenny, my first protest was highly influenced by CND grandmas, as I like to say, because it was watching some of you guys perhaps getting arrested at the 2017 Stop the Arms Fair protest that inspired me into the activism that I'm doing today. So thank you to the whole CND movement. It's really powerful, and getting together in the way that you do and continuing to show up and fill those spaces has been, has changed my life and is monumental in so many other ways as well. So yes, I founded Demilitarized Education, and since then we have built the world's first university in arms database. And what that means is we track university investments, research, and academic partnerships. So far, we have uncovered and exposed over £2.2 billion worth of UK university partnerships with the arms trade and military. It's incredible to think about that data in the context of the economic transformation that we require to really survive, to really have security systems that are pleasing and useful to all people in our country. 2.2 billion, and that's just what we've found. We, of course, expect there to be a lot more. Now, what we do with this data is we work with students and staff across the country and communicate with university administration to campaign for commitments and compliance to the Demilitarized Education Treaty. This treaty is a policy roadmap, essentially. It talks the university through different articles of expectations around how we expect them to have their investment policy, research policy, their inclusion processes, and so on. Now, it's really incredible because this framework is the first of its kind, as well as the database. And we've had contact from Australia, Princeton University in the USA, Antwerp University, and others internationally who are now using that framework to campaign at their campuses as well. And I think it's important to tell you guys that because it demonstrates the way that our infrastructure is helping the campaigners internationally now to be able to build consistent language and consistent campaign structures around divestment and disarmament. Now, for me, universities are an incredibly powerful strategic node for disarmament. And why? Because they're an incredibly powerful strategic node for the advancement of war. So we have to be able to look and see why it's so important to the arms trade and military, and then understand that we are at a major advantage in these spaces because I can't think of another place in our society where so many people are together physically. Anyone here that went to university will know that you don't have that kind of sense of live-in community as you do at a university, and it's why university campaigns across the board have been so successful historically. And that is why targeting these places, targeting these institutions, getting union motions passed in favour of demilitarisation and disarmament, getting SU motions passed, and advocating for clear policy around arms exclusion will have monumental and is having huge divestment impact and steps towards making sure that the military and arms supply chain isn't just constantly growing. Now, there has been some major difficulties, particularly in 2025, after the Starmer government started to redefine their relationship with universities as the Defence Universities Alliance. And this marks a new direction where the government isn't trying to hide these often historically secret partnerships. And this is incredibly worrying because millions of pounds, billions in total is going towards the further militarization of our society, and education is really key to the way that they're doing that. For example, they're putting £182 million into 5 new defence technical colleges, and they're getting UCAS involved to promote military jobs at the point of student recruitment. So this, of course, is a big tide that we're fighting against at the moment. However, last year was also really successful, of course, with this complete collapse in governance that's happening across the world, the genocide in Palestine, Sudan, and so on, has led to there being many more eyes on the need for ethical divestment. And that has meant that King's College Cambridge was the first Oxbridge college to change their investment policy last year to no longer include arms. We also had York University. King's College Cambridge was an interesting one because they are a hugely militarized institution with a war department, but they did get pressured by their students to no longer include controversial arms companies. Of course, BAE Systems managed to slip through that categorization, so the divestment impact wasn't actually anything at all, but still it shows the direction that our momentum is taking these campaigns and pressurizing institutions to be able to not turn away from the risk of their reputation while they continue to partner with such awful institutions. In terms of...
You're nearly at time, Kinsella. You're nearly at time. You're nearly at time.
Thank you. Yes, so final point is that the atomic weapons establishment is seriously involved with universities. We have new nuclear warheads being built at Sheffield University. And for example, atomic weapons establishment has promoted 124 postgraduate and postdoctorate research contracts and had 190 papers published across STEM journals in 2024 and 2025. So just wanted to get that in to give you a bit of awareness around how it is a node for nuclear armament as well, and just inspire you all to continue using our education systems as a really powerful point in our system to criticize, scrutinize, and work against the military industrial complex. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinsella. That was fantastic. And thank you so much for the work that you've done. It's so impressive. It's great. So we'll move on to our fourth speaker now. Our fourth speaker is Melissa Park, and she came on just before and said welcome or hello from Geneva, which I guess is where she's speaking from. Melissa is the Executive Director of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. She served as an ambassador for ICANN Australia in 2017 to 23. She was a member of the Australian Parliament, and she served as Minister for International Development. Melissa has also worked as an international lawyer with the UN and a member of the UN group of eminent experts on the Yemen. She's done such a lot of fantastic work, and ICANN is, such a great organisation. So welcome, Melissa, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And thank you to CND London for the invitation to be with you today. Many of you would have seen this week Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, speaking at the World Economic Forum, where he admitted what all of us have always known, that Western nations have gone along with the so-called international rules-based order for decades, lecturing other nations on human rights and democracy while looking the other way, or even worse, participating with enthusiasm in fiascos like Afghanistan and Iraq, when the US carried out wars, regime change operations, coups and acts of terrorism, and ignored international mechanisms and law as it suited them. Carney did not apologise for his country having gone along with this situation. Rather, he seemed to regret that the comfortable lie was over. He referred to the Czech former President Havel's essay entitled The Power of the Powerless, in noting that the system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true, and its fragility comes from the same source. Thus, when one person stops living within the lie, the illusion begins to crack. And Carney then exhorted middle powers to live the truth by naming reality, to stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised, and to call it what it is, a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion. His statement omits to mention the context of violence that has been imposed on many of the world's peoples, that it is not just economic coercion being used. Nuclear weapons are another instrument of coercion. On top of the colonial and racist history of testing nuclear weapons and doing other things to vulnerable and Indigenous communities that Bell talked about so eloquently, the bombing we've seen in recent years, a number of things happening. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities by Israel and the US bombings of other countries, including Venezuela, Israel's bombing of Lebanon, Qatar, Syria and Yemen, and its ongoing genocide in Gaza. And it's clear that far from bringing stability to the world, that nuclear weapons are being used to coerce and intimidate, and they are engendering a sense of impunity among countries that have them. The UK, another nuclear armed state, albeit one that's beholden to the US to actually use them, presents itself as a defender of the rules-based order, while systematically disengaging from the very legal processes that uphold it. For example, its weapons exports to Saudi Arabia and Israel in disregard of obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, its failure to disarm under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and its voting patterns at the United Nations, where the UK has opposed resolutions on nuclear disarmament and voted alongside Russia and North Korea to resist mandates for scientific research into humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear war and to address the legacy of nuclear testing. This moment doesn't prove that rules and international law are obsolete. It demonstrates the cost of selectively abandoning them. What is failing today is not international law, but the willingness of some governments to be bound by it on equal terms. And although Canada's Prime Minister is now calling out the lie of the so-called international rules-based order, his country is still going along with the dangerous lie of nuclear deterrence. If Canada or any other country under a so-called nuclear umbrella were to concede that this policy endangers rather than protects its citizens, the system would begin to fall apart. Until then, peace-minded countries and civil society acting collectively for the common good must continue to ramp up the pressure on these states by pointing out the hypocrisies and inconsistencies that endanger the whole world. The UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, is a shining example of such action, and it celebrated its 5th anniversary of coming into force this week on Thursday, the 22nd of January. During the past 5 years, the treaty has had a significant impact. It has closed the legal gap. The TPNW marks the point at which the international community codified that nuclear weapons are incompatible with international human rights and humanitarian law, environmental protection, and long-term security. The treaty has broken the two-class system of powerful nuclear weapon states versus powerless non-nuclear weapon states. It has brought the issue of nuclear weapons into the hands of all states equally in the General Assembly. It has reinforced the nuclear taboo that nuclear weapons can never be used because of the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental harm they cause. The treaty provides the first international framework for assistance to communities and environments harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing, and acknowledges the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and on Indigenous peoples. The TPNW has prompted financial institutions to divest billions of dollars from the companies that manufacture nuclear weapons. It has solidified the international consensus that nuclear threats are unacceptable. It's provided a powerful challenge to the misguided and dangerous nuclear deterrence narrative of pro-nuclear states by showing that nuclear weapons threaten global security, not enhance it. And
Melissa, can you wind up now, Melissa? You're at time.
Okay. And the treaty provides a focus for civil society to mobilise around and support governments that want to abolish nuclear weapons. And as a result of these efforts, the treaty now has a global majority of countries as either full states parties or signatories, and we know there will be more by the time of the first TPNW review conference to be held in November this year, chaired by South Africa. And we expect the first TPNW review conference will provide a clear contrast with the 11th NPT review conference to be held in April and May of this year, and for which the prospects are gloomy. As we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the TPNW coming into force and set our sights towards the inaugural TPNW review conference, I want to thank CND campaigners for your passion and commitment. And as a number of speakers have stated today, at this moment in time, our solidarity, our collective efforts to uphold international law, to attain justice and to end nuclear weapons are more important than ever. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melissa, so much. Just a word to our audience that the Q&A is now on. So if you would like to start putting your questions into the Q&A, then we'll have some for the time that we've had our last speaker. We're going on now to our last speaker for this panel, who is Tom Unterreiner. Tom is the chair of CND. He is also a spokesperson for the campaign that represents CND on Stop Rearm Europe and other partner organisations. Tom's part of the European nuclear disarmament movement and a regular contributor to End Info Journal. He works for the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation and edits a spokesman. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, Tom. He's going to be talking on European rearmament. Thank you. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite to talk to you today. And just to Melissa, thanks for your contribution. On the 22nd of January 2021, we celebrated my youngest son's first birthday, and we also celebrated the coming into force of the TPNW. So if you hear some crazy noise in the background throughout my contribution, it's because his birthday party is this afternoon and is understandably incredibly excited. The question of European rearmament is a huge one with many aspects, many moving parts, very many things happening. So I'm going to try and focus down on just two key points if I can. The first key point is that money and spending is not everything when it comes to rearmament and remilitarization. Point one. Point two, though, is that getting our heads around exactly where the money is coming from and how it is flowing and to whose benefit it is being used tells us something quite important about the overall dynamics of what's going on. So in December last year, tens of thousands of German school students staged a nationwide strike across 90 towns and cities. These young people staged mass protest actions against government proposals to vary Germany's much modified and historically contentious conscription laws. In 2011, conscription was put into abeyance by the German government, although the government always retained its powers to reintroduce it. In late 2025, the German government passed legislation to introduce a questionnaire to be completed by all 18-year-old men. The questionnaire is designed to determine their willingness to be conscripted, or to put it more bluntly, to kill and be killed. The 55,000 on the streets and the very many more of them who thought similarly gave their answer to that question. So why open a short discussion of European rearmament with this example? Because something as mundane as issuing a questionnaire and the explicit response to it helps us to clarify the nature of some of the moving parts in the maelstrom of noise, deception and confusion swirling around the rearmament issue. For instance, why is Germany edging towards conscripting 18-year-olds when any war they might be sent to die in will be dominated at best by high-tech, hyper-sophisticated, already battle-tested death machines, or at worst, the prospect of nuclear war and universal destruction? To what use will a relative handful of inexperienced and untrained near children be put in a war waged with drones, AI-enhanced weaponry, missiles and the rest, other than as potential victims for drones, AI weaponry, missiles and the rest? What, if not the normalisation of a drive to war and the prospect of war itself, is the purpose of this move? What, if not a clumsy attempt to garner societal consent for a drive to war, is the purpose of this questionnaire and similar moves we see elsewhere? The basic fact of the matter is that European rearmament and the remilitarisation of society is about more than dollars, pounds and euros. Money and finance is political, of course, but there is a lot more to political power than money alone. Coercion and consent walk hand in hand, which is why the tens of thousands of protesters in Germany and a growing number across Europe are of such importance. We do not consent, and we will not be easily coerced into driving along their road to war. Yet this war fever is real, and the instruments of political power fueling European rearmament are very real indeed. Take, for instance, it's truly remarkable decision by European Union institutions to issue 150 billion euros in loans to finance war readiness. This scheme was originally named Rearm Europe and then rechristened Security Action for Europe, or SAFE. You see what they did there? This 150 billion is to be found using a mechanism originally proposed and designed at the close of the 1980s for the purposes of eliminating unemployment, poverty, for funding social needs and improving life in general across the European Union. At the time, this proposal was roundly and tragically, in my opinion, rejected by the main powers in the EU. Now the mechanism has been revived, not for the purpose of social good, but to facilitate death and destruction. European states have been told, as we have been told in the UK, that all the additional arms spending, all this preparation for war, will produce dividends across the economy. It's true, as multiple research studies have indicated, that the multiplier effect of military spending, that is, the society-wide economic benefits of spending, is much lower for spending on weapons than for other sections of the economy. But it should be noted that there is a multiplier effect. It's just not as significant as for other sectors of the economy, which is why the mechanism employed for SAFE is, from this point of view, remarkable. They've made a deliberate political choice to send money one way. So I think we need to assume that they are not sincere about society-wide dividends for military spending. And if we dig a little deeper, we get another telling dimension to our story. Take, for instance, Professor Elke Schwarz's recent research and submissions to Parliament, parliamentary committees, on the role of venture capital in the context of the UK's National Security and Strategic Defence Review. Schwarz points out that historically, venture capital has not been a major factor in the defence sector. She characterises venture capital as being focused on, to quote, specific technology, not on specific technology, but growth in valuations. And the higher the valuation, the larger the gains on investors' equity stakes at the point of exit. To be very clear, she continues, the business aim of venture capital companies is not necessarily to invest in a robust British technology innovation base, but rather in the growth potential of the companies that are enrolled into the defence industry environment. She goes on to point out that significant lobbying, political influence, and structural tactics are employed by venture capital, and they're deployed to secure their interests. Venture capital is now deeply interested in UK and European-wide arms manufacturing and the arms industry. And the bedrock of venture capital is based where? In the United States. What we are seeing is a massive state-backed, deliberate and coordinated facilitation of US venture capital and their interests in the arms industry, an industry that is increasingly high-tech, AI-driven, and increasingly destructive. Which brings us back to the brutal politics of the matter. For all the talk of the US as an unreliable ally in the so-called defence of Europe, for all the question marks raised over NATO, for all the fire and fury from the White House, for all this, the reality is that the US nuclear presence in Europe is not getting smaller, it is expanding. US firms are circling European rearmament, looking for massive profits. European states, whatever the views of various fractions, are committed to mass rearmament and war-fighting preparedness. And in doing so, they are engaged in a massive state assistance program for US venture capital. That far from ensuring the defence and security of Europe, Europe is being primed for plunder and put at more risk. All of which and much more points us in the direction, in one direction, the need to build clear, consistent and honest opposition to European rearmament, and the need to redouble our efforts pointing towards the concept of common security. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom. Right, we are now open for questions, and I've got the first one through. So the question is, European countries have responded to Trump's desire to seize Greenland, calling for a stronger NATO, but NATO is a US-led alliance. It makes no sense. Can CND put out a clear call to leave NATO? Some young people in Germany have begun making this point, and that's from Kate. So, panelists, shall we ask Tom, I think, to start with that question? Because it's you've been talking about these young people in Germany, Tom. So, what's the response? Can CND put out a clear call for us to leave NATO?
Well, CND is committed to leaving NATO, and for a variety of reasons, the most fundamental of which is that in essence, NATO is a nuclear armed alliance. That is what it is. And for that reason alone, we are opposed to it. But one of the things to look out for, and one of the key aspects of what's going on at the minute, is that kind of for certain people, the veil has been lifted, or the illusions are falling away, because we are told over and over again that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's an alliance for the security of Europe. And CND and others have long, tried to expose and explain that this is simply not the case, that it's a nuclear alliance dominated by the United States. And now that part of the reality has been exposed, there is mass panic and mass indignation. And I think we do need to find a way of relating to that very, very clearly. And it's good that in different parts of Europe, people are raising the call to leave NATO and to expose what it's about. But fundamentally, for CND, we are opposed to British or any membership of the NATO alliance, and we will continue to say so.
Fantastic. We've got another question in. What I'll do in a minute is give any panelists who want to come in a chance to speak again, just very, very briefly to answer some of the questions. But we've got another question, which is this. What's the best way to respond to people who say if Venezuela and Ukraine, etc., had nuclear weapons, they would not have been attacked? And this is an argument that's being used a lot. The question is coming from Jenny Clegg. Who should we ask to answer that? I wonder, Melissa, if maybe you would like to take up that question?
Hello, yes. Yes, we hear this a lot, but I think the point about nuclear weapons is that nuclear weapons do not make the world safer, they make it infinitely more dangerous. If you were to just look at the situation with the guns in the United States, do more guns in the United States make the US and its people safer? Or does it make it more ripe for accidents and for other deaths? I think it's the argument is like Ukraine was never in a position to hold on to its nuclear weapons, and so it's one of those hypothetical questions that gets asked that really I think don't make any sense. And the other point about it is that any use of a nuclear weapon would be suicidal. So what is the benefit to a country of having nuclear weapons if it's going to mean the end of that country? So those are, I think, just short answers to those questions, but other people may have other points of view on that.
I think those are very well-made points, Melissa. Thank you very much. We do have another question now. I'm not sure who this has come from, but the question is, how can we ease the tension of nuclear deterrence right now as NATO is being tested on Eastern Europe? So I think that's kind of a similar type of question to the one that we just had about Ukraine. What if Ukraine or Venezuela had nuclear weapons? Can we go perhaps to Jenny Jones to answer this one? Have you got any thoughts, Jenny, on how we might ease the tension of nuclear deterrence right now as NATO is being tested on Eastern Europe?
I'm not sure we can do much apart from through the political process, which is obviously the process I know about. We can always lobby our MPs, and that's an incredibly powerful way to allow politicians to understand what the mood is. And it's brilliant if it can come from a lot of people, from a lot of areas, with a lot of quite divergent sort of backgrounds. It really helps. Don't lobby peers. Most of them don't have staff. They don't look at their emails. It's a complete waste of time. But I think it's happening for us. Trump has actually moved us into territory that we have not been forced to think about for quite some time. And so he is actually destroying NATO. We might not have to leave it. It might be destroyed. And also, he is making us rethink having a nuclear deterrent, so-called. Actually, do we have a different phrase for nuclear deterrent when it's not really a deterrent? I think that history is moving in our direction at the moment, and any way that we can give a little push by actually making the political class aware of how we feel would be a very good idea.
Thank you, Jenny. We're still getting questions coming in. This one is specifically for Gisela, so I'll ask you to answer this one, Gisela. I'm not entirely clear of the question of what it means, but I think it's saying, does demilitarize education, so your organisation, are you working in your campaign work with trade unions, and particularly in University College Union? I'm guessing that that this person might work at University College London.
Yes, so we are, and great news, because on Thursday, we found out that on Wednesday, Bristol Staff Union, UCU, actually passed our demilitarised education motion. And we've had success recently at Glasgow as well. We would love for you to reach out, get in contact, and we have motion templates ready to go, and we can obviously brief and prepare you for putting those motions forwards to your community. We also have an open letter, I should mention, which I'd love for anyone who is a university stakeholder, so a staff, student, alumni, to sign. We have over 1,500 signatures at the moment, and please keep helping us to build pressure and momentum via simple methods of that way. Hopefully someone from CND can put my email in the chat so you can reach out to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Ginsello. Great answer. And yeah, I'm sure you'd be more than happy to have people from trade unions working alongside you. We've had a couple of questions come in. I think it's from La France Insoumise, which presumably you're joining us from France. So I'm going to give this question. It goes, how can France and the UK, as countries sitting on the Security Council, work together for peace? I'd love to see more dialogue with France Insoumise, for instance. Now, that's quite a complicated question because, of course, a lot of us won't really have much of an idea of how to get our international governments to work together. But perhaps we could refer this question to Joanne, because I think that they have set up an international peace conference last year, and they might well like to do some work with France Insoumise. So can I turn to you, please, Joanne? And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you would be willing to work with an organisation from France. Thank you.
Yes, interesting question. We did have, as part of the Peace Camp last year, we had like an international peace conference, and we did have people from like all over the world came, including Europe, and that was a good way, I think, for us all to share sort of how we're doing things. And we would be really happy to speak to peace campaigners from France, because we have organisations who are in the alliance who are from Europe and are from like all the way around the world, and ICANN are part of it as well. So there's a lot of different organisations, and I think between us, everything that we know, we can help other people and they can probably help us. So yeah, it's just about that, working together, and we can share what we do, other people can share what they do. I don't know, does that answer the question specifically?
Well, the question specifically was a little bit different and a little bit perhaps on a different level. But I think an invitation to La France Insoumise to contact Lake and Heath Alliance for Peace, and they would be, you'd be very much welcome to to get involved there. I also know that Stop the War has an international peace conference coming up, so all of these are going to be sharing ideas and being able, devising ways to put pressure onto our governments to work together for peace. I'm sorry. We've got another question coming in. This is from Ellie, and the question goes: how does dismantling NATO relate to the migrant crisis? I.e., if NATO falls, will that alleviate violence amongst the migrant crisis in Central Asia and Africa, or will that let Russia be more aggressive with its power? Now, I'm not quite sure who to give this question to. Can we try you, perhaps, Tom? Would you have a response to that question? Shall I repeat it? Shall I repeat it, or have you got the question in your head there?
I think I've got the premise of the question, but it seems to me that in some ways the premise of the question is that NATO does something to alleviate the migrant crisis in the first place, and I just don't believe that is the case. If you look at, for instance, what happened in Afghanistan, I mean, Article 5 was invoked. NATO forces were involved. We've had, the whole Trump episode over the last period. And as with other Western interventions, you had, one part of the disaster that turned into Afghanistan turned into, and the West's intervention there, led by the United States, was a massive migrant crisis. So I don't think one thing automatically follows the other. But the political context in which NATO would be disbanded would be a very different political context from the one we are currently in, because if European states withdraw from NATO in a consistent and realistic way, rejecting the nuclearism rejecting the idea that power projection creates any sense of defence or security, they would necessarily, in my view, have to adopt an approach to security characterised by a common security approach, which takes all aspects of the threats to human life into account and doesn't merely peddle the myth that nuclear weapons creates any sort of stability or safety in Europe or globally. So I think the states involved in a future common security approach would take questions of migration and the fate of other parts of the world very seriously indeed. But what you have at the moment with NATO is a complete disregard for any of those questions. An approach to world affairs which drives things like the migrant crisis and climate catastrophe and the rest of it. And CND advocates for a very, very different approach to security questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. We're going to wind up
Sorry,
this panel
Sally,
now.
could I just come in very briefly on that question?
Yes, is that Jenny? I can't see who it is.
Sorry, yes, I've got my... Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Tom very kindly introduced the whole idea of the climate catastrophe. And what I would say is that the potential breakup of NATO is part of a real churn in world politics. And climate catastrophe has been seen by our military as the biggest potential threat. That was before Trump, of course. But 5 years ago, they were saying that the amount of turbulence that's going to be created by climate disruption is going to be absolutely massive in terms of failing food supplies, and that's here in Britain as well, and also in the movement of peoples, because there will be places that are flooded out, that are deserts, that are islands where the sea level has risen. And so the breakup of NATO might have some impact, but there are other bigger forces that are happening that will probably have a greater impact. Thank you.
Yeah, point well made. Thank you very much, Jenny. Right, we're 1 minute from the end of our session and we are going to finish now. So thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you to you if you put a question in.
Welcome back, everyone. My name's Hannah Kemp-Welsh and I'm a Vice Chair of London CND. I'm going to be co-chairing this panel with Carol Turner. Our speakers are going to be looking at some of the issues that we focused on this morning that have an impact and how they have an impact beyond Britain and Europe. So first, I'm going to invite Carol to give a short introduction.
Thanks, Hannah. I must say, I haven't timed myself, so I'm hoping that you're going to make sure I don't slip over 5 minutes. The last session dealt primarily with some of the immediate practicalities in campaigning against nuclear weapons and war. This session aims to step back and take a longer term look at the forces that are driving the world to war. The threat of war is a really important discussion at this crucial time, and that's not just because what's happening right now in Gaza and Ukraine and elsewhere. It's because this is an important point in international politics. As Trump's invasion of Venezuela and his threats of taking over Greenland continue, it's waking us up to the Make America Great Again movement. The MAGA project is awake to this as nothing else in the last year has been. As Jeffrey Sachs said so simply and so incisively at the UN Security Council's emergency session on Venezuela, the issue is not what we think about the character of the government, it's the issue of whether or not another state has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or exercise control over its affairs. Trump's action in Venezuela forces us to confront the possibility of world war. And as Sachs told us at the UNSC, Given that we live in the nuclear age, humanity would perish. There would be no second chance, as there was after World War I and World War II. In practice, of course, the ability to invade another country and take control lies in the hands of very few states, the United States being foremost amongst them. The US National Security Strategy, which was published last November, laid out what's behind the actions that Trump are taking. And I just want to take a minute to read you what are almost direct quotes. Trump's introduction is clear. My administration has moved with urgency and historic speed to restore American strength at home and abroad. In everything we do, we are putting America first. The NSS is a roadmap to ensure that America remains the greatest and most successful nation in history. And the document actually spells this out. It specifies that the US seeks to have the world's strongest and most dynamic economy, with a robust industrial base and energy sector to maintain that economy, and which allows the United States to field the world's most important, lethal, and technologically advanced military to protect US interests, to deter wars, and, if necessary, to win them quickly and decisively, with the lowest possible casualties to American forces. The US National Defense Strategy was published only a couple of days ago. You may not even have picked it up, let alone had opportunity to scan it or to read it. It deploys the same concepts and the same sort of terminology to flesh out some of the changes the Trump administration is going to make to US military posture. Strip away the superlatives, and you have US security policy in a nutshell. The strongest economy with the best nukes and the most powerful military to ensure the United States stays at the top of the mountain. That's what MAGA means. When Trump retweets a map of the Western Hemisphere covered in the American flag, he's deadly serious. The extent to which he can achieve it remains to be seen, but this is the MAGA endgame. And it's why governments across Europe are driving hard to remilitarize, why they're increasing military spending in order to rearm. And it's why, like Keir Starmer in Britain, they're prepared to shoulder so much public unpopularity by failing to restore public services and tackle the cost of living crisis. This is the end they're aiming for. The threat of taking over Greenland in the last couple of weeks has fueled two interrelated and coextensive debates amongst Trump's allies. Is the US disengaging from Europe? And are we witnessing the beginning of the breakup of NATO? The answer to the first question, to disengagement, is most definitely not. On the contrary, NATO architecture is expanding across Europe, and that's something that Tom has been pointing out to CND and on the meetings and media interview he does for quite a time now. He tells me how little pickup he gets when he makes this point. The mainstream media is following government and avoiding this aspect of the public debate, and many of the progressive forces, including some of the anti-war movement, seem to be unaware of what's going on. New US and NATO military facilities are coming on stream across Europe. Lakenheath Air Base, where the US are storing their nuclear weapons, and RAF Marham near King's Lynn, where the fighter jets that will deliver them are stationed. They're dedicated to NATO's European Nuclear Command.
Sorry to interrupt, Carol, you're at time, if you could wrap up.
Right, will do. And both of them are part of NATO's deadly European nuclear network. The second question is open to debate. Some commentators are arguing that NATO is breaking up. Others are talking about a transition rather than a break. The anti-war movement has got to get wise up to these debates. Our strength is in understanding our ability to bring the movement out on the streets, and that's what we're discussing for the rest of the session. Thank you to Hannah. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Carol, for your opening remarks. Very useful. Our first speaker will be Kate Hudson. Kate, I'm sure all of you know, is Vice President of CND and its former General Secretary from 2010 till 2024. Kate is a long-time anti-nuclear and anti-war campaigner and author of CND at 60, Britain's most enduring mass movement. Kate is a historian with a weather eye on CND's role. Kate says, the greatest lesson I learnt is that CND is most effective when we work in alliance with others and engage internationally. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Hannah. It's great to be here. What an interesting conference. And thanks, Carol, for those opening remarks. I think we've probably all been following the recent attempts at a peace settlement. I think it's clear that the possibility of such a thing is increased slightly with the ongoing trilateral meetings. It seems now that we're waiting for the second round next weekend. And of course, a positive outcome to those talks is eagerly awaited by millions across the world. First and foremost, of course, those directly affected by the war in Ukraine and also Russia. But the war is also having an enormous impact globally. We tend in our campaigning to focus, I think rightly, on the increasing global polarization between the US on the one hand and China and Russia on the other, and all the dangers that that brings, including the risk of nuclear war. But there are other consequences too. The impact on the global economy is massive, with major implications affecting everyone. This is in large part because Russia and Ukraine are normally both major grain producers, and exports have been disrupted, as has Russia's role as a major energy exporter. Here, of course, we've seen our energy and food prices increase significantly. But of course, the prices are higher, as well as the commodities being more scarce across the world as well. The overall result is increased inflation, slower growth, disruption of supply chains, and economic uncertainty. Food insecurity is one of the most serious impacts, particularly in the global south. There is an increased risk of starvation in vulnerable areas, as well as malnutrition and social unrest going along with that. According to the UN World Food Programme, just in the war's first year, the number of people suffering from acute food insecurity in the 81 countries that they monitor jumped by 17%. That is from 276 million people to 323 million. And that figure has increased by another 10% every year. So it's an escalating problem, particularly for countries in the global south. Of course, these factors come on top of the negative economic impact of COVID-19, which we saw resulted in massive inflation at that time. The war coming almost directly after has doubled down on a lot of those economic problems. And increased military spending that Carol was referring to is impacting in Europe too. We have rearmament to the detriment of welfare state spending and also increasing economic hardship and again, social unrest alongside that. The Ukraine war is also making a big contribution to deglobalization, which is something we've seen over the past few years, with a fragmentation of the global political economy and current global economic flux. Alongside that is going political flux too, and a geopolitical realignment, with an increased Russia-China axis and divisions now clear between Europe and the US. As well as the economic and political impact, there is also a climate impact. There are massively increased greenhouse gas emissions, over 230 million tonnes of carbon dioxide in the first 3 years of the conflict. That's equivalent to the combined emissions of Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. The source of those is the war itself, that's to say the military activity taking place. But we also need to factor in the destruction of infrastructure and the subsequent need for reconstruction. And in that reconstruction process, there will be carbon emissions too. There are also terrible fires, both from military action and damage to facilities like oil refineries, and they are really pumping out carbon emissions too. There's also direct environmental damage like pollution, oil spills, threats to biodiversity, and so on. And those have long-lasting effects on Russia and Ukraine, of course, but their impact obviously spills out beyond that. So to conclude, I'll just touch on the attitudes from the global south, which is important politically. This has generally been one of active non-alignment or neutrality in the war. They have, generally speaking, refused to sign up to the US condemn and attack approach to Russia or to participate in sanctions. I guess it's pretty obvious to this audience why that is. There's a big element of distrust of Western motives, double standards based on the experience of colonialism. The Global South has a preference, as does CND and many others, for a multipolar world. So they're not buying into the US narrative. And of course, many see BRICS as a route to a more just order. So what the outcome will be is hard to judge. And as Carol pointed out, Trump's recent attack on Venezuela has shown that we are in a no-holds-barred world. The US is determined not only to maintain its global reach and keep down rising powers like China, but to extend it through military might with no restraint. So all the more reason for our movement to work for peace and strengthen our alliances nationally and internationally to make the case against war and nuclear weapons and to make sure we win that struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Gosh, those statistics around food insecurity are just harrowing. Thank you for bringing such a global perspective into the room. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome, is Rivka Barnard from Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which leads the Gaza Coalition. Rivka is the Palestine Solidarity Campaign's Deputy Director of Campaigns, and as well as overseeing PSC's campaign programme, she writes and speaks on PSC's boycott, divestment and sanctions, boycott Barclays, right to protest and other campaign issues. Rivka, I'm going to welcome you now for your presentation. Thanks.
Oh, thanks so much, Hannah, and thanks to Kate, who spoke before you. I'm really happy to be here today speaking. Thanks to London CND for the opportunity, and I'm proud to be speaking as a card-carrying CND member myself. But of course, I'm here today speaking on behalf of Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I think it's a really important time for us to be speaking about Palestine because Palestine, and more specifically, the experience of the Palestinian people, has almost entirely dropped off the media agenda here in Britain. And let me just say, clarify that point. We're hearing a lot about Gaza in the media and from British politicians, mostly through the machinations of Donald Trump, who we've talked about a lot today. But we're hearing about it as though it's detached from the people, as a piece of land that's up for grabs. And of course, we need to be following the detail and fighting back against this imperialist agenda for Palestine. But I think it's really important for us to do so with a consciousness of what all of this means for the Palestinian people and their liberation struggle, and to make sure that our thinking and our work starts from that foundational place of solidarity. So I'm going to start my comments by speaking to what the Palestinian people are facing now, just to ground my comments there. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone here that since the so-called ceasefire of October 2025, Israel has continued its military attacks on the Gaza Strip daily. Nearly 500 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli attacks since the so-called ceasefire, including in this past week an attack which killed 3 Palestinian journalists and 2 children. So health workers, journalists, children are still being targeted specifically by the Israeli military. And whilst the ceasefire was largely predicated on the expectation of Israel allowing food and medical supplies into Gaza, the supplies that are coming in are very meager. It's less than half of what was expected. And that's not because the aid is not available. It's because Israel is still refusing its entry. And of course, that results in widespread malnourishment, malnutrition, especially in babies and children, and starvation. In the Gaza Strip, winters are very hard anyway, but it's been a very particularly difficult one. There's been a huge amount of flooding with heavy rains and freezing conditions, and that means that the makeshift tents that hundreds of thousands of people are living in provide barely any protection from the elements. So the picture is really grim. It's beyond grim, actually. But unfortunately, Palestinian suffering is also not confined to Gaza. In the Israeli-occupied West Bank, the situation is also worse than it's ever been before, as Israeli settlers have accelerated their land grabs and attacks on Palestinian communities. This looks like attacks on Palestinian farmers as they're harvesting their crops, the stealing or killing of livestock, and in some cases, Israeli settlers, with the protection of the military, entering Palestinian villages in mobs and setting fire to homes, places of worship, schools, etc. On top of all of this, one of the most urgent crises facing Palestinians is Israel's practice of mass arbitrary arrest and detention of Palestinians under really horrific conditions, sweeping up thousands of people and holding them in torture camps. And some people may have seen there was an expose in The Guardian this past week on Israel's use of sexual violence as a form of torture against Palestinian political prisoners. This week, I spoke to some Palestinian human rights lawyers that I know in the West Bank, and they said it's always been horrible, but it's never been this bad. And at the same time, there's never been a moment where the torture, the horrific conditions has been so well evidenced and so clear to Israel's international allies, including Britain. But still, no action has been taken by the British government. In fact, action has been taken, but that's to increase its support for Israel. And this brings me to the next point I want to make about international complicity with Israel's ongoing genocide, including Britain. And the recent news about Trump's so-called Board of Peace has shown again the sheer brazenness with which the Trump administration is intent on ripping up any semblance of the rules-based order. Of course, that was an order that was a farce beforehand, but this sort of masks off moment isn't making that any better. But it's also shown, again, the extent to which the British government is going along with it, and arguably was in on it from the beginning. Of course, it's good news that the British government has so far decided not to join the Board of Peace, but it's absurd that the basis of that rejection seemed to be on the inclusion of Putin rather than over the fact that it's a straight-on attack on Palestinian self-determination and an entrenchment of prolonged colonial rule over Palestine, as though if Putin was not involved, somehow the Board of Peace would be a great plan for the Palestinian people. Britain's involvement with Israel and Israel's apartheid regime is decades old, as many of you know, but its involvement in Israel's genocide over the past 2 years has been extensive and ongoing throughout, despite the British government's attempts to act as though the suspension of a few arms licenses last year was a significant withdrawal of support for genocide, which it wasn't. But with all of this grim detail, I think it would be a mistake for us to say that British complicity has been uncontested. And I think it's worthwhile for us as a movement to reflect on the steps, however small they may seem in relation to the crimes that we're facing, the steps that we've started to make, chipping away at Britain's support for Israel. So I want to give just a few notable examples from the past year. In May, after years of campaigning from local PSC branches and others, the Co-op supermarket chain announced last May that it would stop stocking Israeli goods, and that is having an effect. Just this past week, there was a report that Israel's food exports are suffering a lack of demand in international markets, so that shows that this targeted boycott action has been working. Activists here have focused on arms factories here in Britain, including those that are involved in the F-16 supply chain, which has forced the government to resort to verbal and legal acrobatics to conceal its ongoing involvement in the F-16 program. And on the local government level, 30 local councils have passed motions in support of divesting from companies involved in Israel's apartheid and genocide. And just recently, nearly 1,000 local councils have committed to taking forward, 1,000 local councillors, have committed to taking forward and supporting work in solidarity with the Palestinian people. That's a massive number, 30 local councils across the country in just the span of about 2 years. And none of these things, these are just a few examples, none of it's happened spontaneously, right? This is the product of strategic campaigning and determined activity from thousands and thousands of activists across Britain, a part of building and expanding our solidarity movement. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the millions of people across Britain who have taken to the streets in our massive marches for Palestine, co-organized by PSC, CND, and the rest of our mobilizing coalition. These marches are a huge part of making visible our solidarity with the Palestinian people and showing the British government also that no matter how hard it tries, it's not going to be able to stop us in our work. Next weekend on Saturday, we're going to be taking to the streets again for our 34th National March for Palestine since October 2023. It's really, really important for us to have huge numbers at that march to show the Trump administration that there will be global resistance to its nefarious plans to run Palestine like a real estate game, to show the British government that we won't be silenced, that we won't give up, and will continue to struggle and push for an immediate arms embargo on Israel, and most importantly, to show the Palestinian people that even if their experience is no longer on the TV screens, that we haven't looked away. So I really hope I can count on all of you to be there next Saturday in numbers. And thanks again for all of you being at this important conference today, and solidarity to everyone.
Thank you so much, Rivka. It was really great to hear some of those hard-won wins. And I'll be there on Saturday. I'm sure many people on this call will be as well. I'm going to hand over to Carol now to introduce the next speaker.
Thanks very much. The elephant in the room so far in our discussions is the topic that our next speaker is going to be addressing. Unsurprisingly, we focused on Europe and to a little extent on Britain. But the reason that Trump is shaping up in the way that he is because of a Cold War with China, America's greatest competitor. And our next contributor, Jenny Clegg, a great friend of mine and a very important member of CND's International Advisory Group, is going to update us on some of the issues that come up. Jenny is an anti-nuclear and anti-war campaigner of many years standing. She's a China specialist and author of China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World. Jenny was a senior lecturer at the University of Central Lancashire and is now an independent writer and researcher on modern China, its history, and its role in the global economy. So over to you, Jenny. Thank you for joining us and fill us in on the China picture.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that introduction. I'm going to jump straight in. At this moment of great uncertainty and disruption in the world, we have to ask what's going on and why it's happening. Carol mentioned Jeffrey Sachs and his speech at the UN Security Council. I think he hit the nail on the head when he said what happened on January the 3rd was not just an attack on Venezuela, but an attack on international law itself. We've seen lawlessness before, he said, but not with nuclear weapons. Some people see the problem in terms of Trump's personality, but we won't understand anything unless we see the context, the decline of the US and the rise of China. Trump's focus on the Western Hemisphere represents a calculated strategy directed against China, aiming to sever links between China and Latin America so as to split the BRICS and fragment the global South, which is the driving force in the multipolar challenge to US dominance. In the Arctic, it aims to create a new zone of conflict to prevent any new links between Europe and China. If we simply see the world in terms of regions, we don't see the whole, the interconnections. For Biden, the Ukraine war was not just about Russia. Defeat was all the more necessary since the Russian victory would embolden China. Back in 2021, Biden named China as America's most consequential geopolitical challenge in the longer term. The US then had to muster its capabilities to outcompete China, especially in the emerging technologies which are transforming warfare: cyber, space, AI, quantum computing. The next 10 years, Biden said at the time, would be decisive. But now, halfway through that decade, China has emerged as a leading power in technologies for the future: EVs, batteries, solar panels, 5G, AI. The pace of change is amazing. I visited 5 major cities in China last year, and nearly every other car number plate was a green one. As for Biden's alliance building, only 40 countries joined his Ukraine coalition. The global South kept out, as Kate mentioned, drawing closer to China. But when Biden called for decoupling from China, the Europeans just shuffled their feet, muttering about de-risking instead. The technological competition with China is hugely costly. The demands of the Magnificent Seven tech companies plus the huge US military budget. Biden was too slow, so now we have Trump in gangster mode. Give me the money or I'll hit you with tariffs like you've never seen. And if you don't, well, see what I did to Venezuela, see what I did to Iran. So money is pouring in, investment, arms purchases from Europe, the UK, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and so on, all to uphold the US and its arms manufacturers. This is the foreign policy of the military-industrial complex. Trump seeks to consolidate the US power base in the Western Hemisphere, secure supply chains, acquire critical minerals, gain control over shipping lanes, ready for a future war. I suggest he doesn't need NATO. The AUKUS Track 2 provides a much more flexible model, building collaboration across borders and with the private sector, wrapping other economies around the world into the US cutting-edge military technologies in those critical areas identified by Biden. Now, in the Asia-Pacific region, tensions between the world's number 2 and number 3 economic powers has escalated alarmingly, threatening the wider world economy. The UK has been deepening its military links with Japan. We worry about the rise of the far right over here, but in Japan, a new ultra-conservative prime minister has been installed. She wants to revise Article 9, the peace clause. She wants to review the 3 non-nuclear principles. And it's no secret that Japan, with its large stockpiles, could build a nuclear weapon almost overnight. And she's sharply increasing the risk of war with China over Taiwan. And China indeed has reasons to fear this revival of Japanese militarism, having lost 30 million people when it fought Japan's aggression between 1931 and 1945. The new Prime Minister has been a frequent visitor to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honours Japan's war dead, including convicted Class A war criminals. She shares then in the politics of the extreme right who deny Japan's wartime atrocities and who glorify Bushido, Japan's warrior spirit, in order to make Japan strong again. AUKUS, meanwhile, is going ahead since the UK has committed to build 12 nuclear-powered submarines. I don't recall that ever being discussed. While South Korea is to manufacture more in the US, quite possibly in contravention of the NPT. In future, then, will Japan and South Korea join AUKUS? Will we even see a nuclear-armed Japan, as well as a Korean peninsula nuclear-armed on both sides of the border? This is the direction of travel if nothing is done to stop it. Meanwhile, Trump has also made Taiwan a priority, turning the island into a powder keg as it stuffs it with unmanned drones, HIMARS, ATACMS missiles to strike deep into Chinese territory. And with the US failing to adopt no first use, failing to reduce the number of nuclear warheads from 6,000, and instead sighting intermediate missiles around China, that country has significantly increased its nuclear arsenal from 300 to 600 warheads over the last few years, whilst maintaining its no first use stance. The US hawks have been saying there'll be a war with China by 2027. And now it seems there may be a war with Europe even sooner. But if people think there's going to be a war, what are they doing to avoid it? The hype about a Chinese threat is nonsense. China hasn't fought a war for 45 years, and the number of Chinese warships prowling around Greenland, or the world beyond its own coastline for that matter, is 0. If China is setting the pace in technological development, we should be spending more money on education so as to prepare for the future, instead of piling munitions into warehouses, which is no use at all. Europe, now threatened itself, seems to have discovered the meaning of sovereignty, not for Venezuela or for Iran or for the Palestinians, of course. The hypocrisy is so blatant and they know it. Cracks are starting to appear in the West's solidity. Carney's speech, for all its limitations, marked a certain recognition that the hypocrisy must end, the world has changed and has become more multipolar, and it's necessary to adapt. Some Labour MPs are calling for a foreign policy based on international law and the UN Charter. So as the Chinese say, in every crisis, there is an opportunity. The world needs a new way of thinking about security, and maybe, just maybe, there is space opening up for us to promote more creative thinking here. A mass-based peace and anti-war movement is beginning to take off. It may be very fragmented, but the opportunity to forefront the nuclear issue and our ideas on common and human security is growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. That's a lot of ground covered very expertly and very quickly. I'm reminded of another saying of the Chinese when I listen to Venezuela and Greenland and so on, and that is, we are living in very interesting times. Before I introduce our last speaker, I want to remind people that they can put some questions in the Q&A panel and have them passed on. I've got a couple. We would welcome a couple more before we end. But our final speaker, in a way, takes us back to where we started. And that is the links between war and the big issues of the time. Bell kicked this conference off with a discussion about racism and war, And Assad Rehman is going to bring us to a close with a discussion about climate change and the impact on war. I'm not going to introduce Assad in the usual way. I imagine that most of the people on the call know that he became Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth UK in August last year, and that he has a long experience of environmental, social and racial justice campaigning. I want to highlight some of the things that I first came across Assad, and that was, gosh, I guess that was maybe 30 years ago now. He was known then, and still is in London circles, as a community organiser. He was associated with the anti-racist campaign, the very long enduring anti-racist campaign, which was the Newham Monitoring Project. And he's taken up issues since then, such as the Justice for Jean-Charles Menendez campaign. He's also a founding member of Stop the War Coalition. So we're going to get a breadth of experience from our final speaker. Thank you for joining us. Assad, over to you.
Good afternoon, thank you, and thank you, Carol, for the very kind introduction. I still feel like I'm 18 and still doing the same thing. So maybe we're destined to say the same thing and do the same thing. And I suppose we've always drawn the thread between the various crises that we face. Look, and I especially want to thank CND for bringing us together today. Like many people, one of my foremost memories of the 80s is, of course, being part of those huge mobilizations and protests, bringing us together, like you're bringing us together today. And for CND, for all of that time, for your clarity, for the courage, and of course, for all of you who are on this call today, for our collective refusal to accept a world where we've permanently balanced on the edge of annihilation. As we've heard from all of the other speakers today, we're meeting at a point when the stories that propped up global order for decades are coming apart. I mean, Melissa was mentioning earlier the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. He said the quiet bit out aloud at Davos last week. International law is applied selectively. The powerful exempt themselves when it suits them. Rules are enforced asymmetrically. And of course, justice depends on who the victim is, as we have heard from Rivka. Their pretense is falling apart as it names what so many people are already feeling. Of course, we're told nuclear weapons will keep us safe. Well, we know the reality is they threaten all life on Earth. We're told endless military spending is unavoidable, and yet we can't find the money to stop the planet burning. We're told that there is, of course, none of that money for the necessary actions, whether it's on climate or inequality, and yet billions are found overnight for war, for weapons, and of course, repression. And we're told that economic inequality is just inevitable, whilst the rich, of course, rig the rules to amass billions and trillions in wealth. And we've all know that these are not mistakes. They're a logic of a system that has always put power, profit, and domination before people, peace, and of course, the planet. Now, I want to just be very brief about the climate crisis because I know many of you already know so much about this, but we are living through a scale of the crisis which is unprecedented. We all know climate breakdown is not a future risk. It's a present emergency. We no longer need to be climate scientists. We see this every single day in every corner of the planet. Heat waves killing thousands, floods washing away homes, droughts destroying harvests, ecosystems collapsing, species disappearing, lives being cut short, and of course, livelihoods being destroyed. We're heading not to the critical 1.5 degree guardrail, we're heading far beyond it, towards a world of at least 2.7 or 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. It's just unprecedented. And hand in hand with that, we're already breaching 7 of the 9 planetary limits that make the Earth safe for human life. So this is not a natural disaster. It is a political failure on a planetary crisis. And we all know it is, of course, deeply unjust. Those suffering first and foremost are always the people who did the least to cause this crisis. Communities in the global south, but now also increasingly working class communities here in the UK, migrants, racialized communities, disabled people, women and young people. Climate change is today, it cannot and has never been just an environmental issue. Of course, as we heard from Belle this morning, it's a crisis. We're a crisis of inequality, a crisis of racism, and a crisis of course, colonial violence. The richest countries, the corporations, the elites have built their wealth on fossil fuels and extraction, and yet they're also failing spectacularly to do their fair share. Emissions are not falling fast enough. We all know that. Fossil fuel expansion continues, especially amongst the richest countries. 55% of all fossil fuel expansion, the European Union, the United States, Australia, Canada, the global north countries. Climate pledges, where they are made, are full of loopholes and false solutions. We, as Friends of the Earth, have had to take the government to court twice about its own targets, showing how little there is in terms of concrete action and how they lack fairness. And of course, the question of climate finance that is owed legally, morally and politically has not been delivered. Estimates today suggest that we need at least $1 trillion a year by 2030 and rising sharply after that. Others put the real cost of climate damage that is already happening, of being able to, having to adapt our economies and our societies and our communities and cut our emissions at the same time, at over $7 trillion a year globally. And of course, what's on the table are loans that deepen debt, austerity that is destroying public services, and fine words. We see it all about partnerships, of course, while money never arrives. So climate justice, we know, requires public finance at scale, grants, not debts, paid not as an obligation, paid as an obligation and not as charity. And of course, what we're seeing instead is what we would call organized negligence. And this is where militarism and nuclear weapons in particular must also be confronted, because the irony and the hypocrisy of governments claiming there is no money for climate justice while pouring obscene sums into war. Military spending, as we've heard from all of the speakers, is rising. Nuclear arsenals are being weaponized, and we're seeing a new arms race accelerating. And of course, the UK is not an exception, whether it's trident renewals to rising defence budgets. This country continues to invest in weapons that can never be used without ending civilization. And let's be absolutely clear, as Friends of the Earth, we've always said you cannot claim to care about the climate whilst investing in the weapons designed to destroy the future. And war is one of the most environmentally destructive activities humanity undertakes. I know it's terrible and to talk about it in that way at the very moment, as we've seen in Palestine, huge human lives being lost, people being killed and maimed in their tens and tens of thousands. But we all know that the militaries are amongst the largest institutional consumers of fossil fuels. They poison land and water, they destroy ecosystems, and of course, they leave toxic legacy. Yet, incredibly, their emissions are conveniently excluded from every single climate target. And of course, nuclear weapons represent the ultimate climate crime. Even a so-called limited nuclear exchange, of course, we all know would trigger catastrophic climate destruction. Food systems, which are already stressed, would collapse. Mass starvation would follow. And of course, we all know that nuclear winter is not rhetoric. It is established by science. The very existence of these weapons makes any claim to be able to protect life on Earth ring hollow. So why do governments persist? Because we also know that militarism is not an accident. It is a strategy. It is how empire manage instability, economic, ecological and political. It's how we distract from inequality at home, how we justify repression, surveillance, borders and violence. And increasingly, and we've seen how countries compete over resources, not just from fossil fuels, but critical minerals to food. It's a new wave of imperialism and colonialism. And it's that logic which is also, of course, tearing apart international law. And from Trump onwards, and of course, we all know it's not just limited to him. We have seen rules treated as optional, treaties abandoned, and institutions hollowed out. We see that from the Climate Treaty to the World Health Organization to the UN itself. And their language of a rules-based order, of course, has always been used to defend power and not justice. And at the very moment we need more cooperation and solidarity, we see a far right rising globally. Authoritarianism going hand in hand with the weaponizing of inequality against climate action, of walls and fences, of fueling Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism. And of course, where the answer to crisis, we're told, is now might is right. And as we heard from Rivka, nowhere is that hypocrisy clearer than in the West's support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. When governments arm, fund and shield mass killing, when they enable the destruction of civilian life, hospitals, homes and ecosystems, of course they're not just defending international law as our government claims. They are destroying it. We've always said ecocide goes hand in hand with genocide. And this matters for climate justice because climate action depends on that cooperation. It depends on trust. It depends on the belief that commitments mean something and that all lives matter equally. So when powerful states show that international law only applies to some, that genocide can be excused and accountability denied, they're telling the world that justice is conditional and promises are always going to be empty. And it's that logic, as we know, that underpins whether it's sanctions, regime change and endless interventions that deepen poverty and make climate resilience an impossibility. So I want to end by just saying, look, we all know we have to tell a more powerful story, a story which is honest and recognizes the reality of this moment. This climate crisis will not be solved by those expanding militaries and clinging to nuclear weapons. Real security does not come from weapons of mass destruction. It won't come from higher defense budgets, and it clearly will not come from nuclear deterrence built on the threat of annihilation. Real security has always come from justice, from water and food and energy justice, from healthcare and housing and dignity, from a stable climate and a livable planet. And that requires a fundamental shift in priorities. It means dismantling those nuclear weapons, not renewing them. It means cutting public and military spending and redirecting those resources into public action and climate action. And of course, it means wealthy countries, including our own, paying their climate debt and ending fossil fuel expansion everywhere. But it also means all of us reclaiming international law as a tool for peace and survival. So the fight for nuclear disarmament is not and never has been separate from climate justice. It is central to it. Because a world that can accept nuclear weapons is a world that can accept mass death. And a world that cannot choose life over war will not survive this crisis. So let me end here and say the future is not being destroyed because we lack solutions. It's because it's being destroyed because those in power refuse to change. And that's why our movements like CND matter, movements like Friends of the Earth matter, a movement of movement, because we always know that justice has never been given from above. It's always been won by us from below. And so a world without nuclear weapons, endless wars, without climate catastrophe, that's the future we have to fight for. And it's a future it's worth fighting for. And it's a future we have no choice but to fight for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassan. That's a wonderful ending. It's about as upbeat as you can get in a meeting which is talking about the threat of nuclear war and world war. I'm going to hand over to Hannah because I know there are a couple of questions in the chat. And perhaps when you've taken those, Hannah, I'd like to come back with a question I saved for from the last panel. It came in at 2 minutes before we ended the session. And I think it's a very big question which all of our panelists can have a stab at before we close the conference. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks very much, Carol, and thank you, Assad, for that wonderful presentation. So we have a few questions here in the chat. We have one from Kate, not Kate Hudson, who is on screen, a second Kate. Kate asks, how possible is it to close down the US military air bases in the UK? And how can we create a mass movement in the UK, bringing together multiple organisations and activist groups to push for this? Actually, Kate, I wonder whether or not you could start us off in response to this.
Okay. Yes, well, it's absolutely possible to do that. Not easy, of course. There are huge forces arrayed against us, but Assad touched on the 1980s and the mass movement then against cruise missiles and so on coming to Britain. The fact is that as a result of that mass movement at the time, not only were those missiles removed from Britain, but also Greenham Common Air Base, which was the kind of central focus for that campaign against it, was also closed down, and it was returned eventually to common land. So these things can be done. As a result of all that campaigning, a big treaty was signed and so on, getting rid of a whole class of nuclear weapons from Europe. So as a movement, we can achieve that kind of thing. No one's saying it's easy. It was a huge struggle for years, involving many different types of campaigning tactics, international mobilization, and so on. But if we have the confidence that we can do that, and if we think big in terms of, yes, we can do that again, then I absolutely think it is possible to take steps forward and to close down those bases. First of all, get people on our side and build those alliances. That is absolutely crucial.
Thanks so much, Kate. There's a lot of popular interest as well in these historic campaign movements. I work in art, and Take Britain recently had a huge exhibition with many massive blown up pictures of Embrace the Base and other key actions at Greenham Common. So it is really in the mainstream public consciousness. And yes, I'm with you as well. We can make it happen again. Would anyone else like to come back on this question? We can move on to the next one. In that case, participants, you're extremely welcome to pose a question using the Q&A function. We just have one other one. Some sort of alarm is going off. I'm not sure why. Apologies. We have a comment rather than a question, maybe, from Kathy Page. This is perhaps towards you, Jenny. Kathy Page asks, are people aware of the writings of Jan Oberg and the Transnational Foundation, who writes a lot of interesting information about life and politics in China?
Oh, yes. Well, thanks for pointing out an alternative source of information about China. I think it's very important for people at the moment to read widely about China and to get to know China a bit better. There is so much misinformation and distortion in the press, and we need to be always having a question mark about what we're being told in the press about China and investigating things further. China has been seen as a threat from the date of the Mongol hordes, and a panic was raised around the films of Fu Manchu that China was going to take over the world from the beginning of the 20th century. So these are very much stereotypes that the media is playing on in order to create concerns that China is out to get us, if you like. I think that there are other sources people might be interested to look at. I'd mention the work of Carlos Martinez. I'd mention people that you can follow on social media. There's an Arnaud Bertrand, Bertrand, who reports, comments a lot on, for example, how China reacted to Carney's speech. And China Square, which is a Belgian outfit and provides lots of information daily if you've got a translate facility on your phone. So I just encourage people to read widely about China and investigate all sides of the arguments about China. I'd also note that China is really opening up to people-to-people exchange. It's dropped visa requirements for a lot of people around the world. Of course, in Britain, we face a lot of visa requirements, but elsewhere it's easier for people to go. But it does make a difference if you go and visit a country and talk to the people about how they're living and how they see things.
I'm going to jump in with the big question of the day, and I'm sure all our panelists will want to have a stab at it. And I'm sure our audience won't mind going over a few minutes to get these answers. It's a pity that Jenny Jones has just left. I wanted to invite her to take a stab at the answer as well. But this was put in the chat, in the Q&A rather, just as we closed the first panel for lunch, and I think it properly belongs to this panel. It comes from Paul Williamson, and he asks a very simple question. Is history repeating itself? Is there going to be another world war? Kate, we're going to start you off with this one, please.
Well, we can't be certain, but a lot of it is determined by what we do. There may well be another world war, but we have to do everything we can to stop it happening. And we've heard today, a lot of the reasons and a lot of the factors that are driving us in that direction. The last thing we should do is think history is repeating itself. There's nothing we can do. That we can't have fatalism of that sort. We can say there are some factors that could go in that direction. Let's do everything we possibly can to prevent that.
Thank you, Kate. Jenny?
Yes, well, there's a huge amount of discussion in the United States about something called the Thucydides trap, which was about the relations in Greece and Sparta centuries ago, about the inevitability of a war between a declining power and a rising power. I don't think that war is inevitable, actually. I think that war is avoidable. I think that we are faced with a world that is in transition to a multipolar world from one in which the US was dominant, and that this is going to be a process. It's going to take place step by step. It's going to be uneven. There's going to be crises. There's going to be adaptation and so on. But I think ultimately it's possible for the dominant global North to adjust eventually to a more equitable relationship with the global South, so long as the global South offers opportunities for the global North to adjust.
Thank you, Jenny. Assad, I'm going to give you the last word, and perhaps as well as addressing the question, you can also comment on the degree to which war is likely to drive us into an even greater climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation, right? Are we dialing back the clock to empire and colonialism, or has empire and colonialism simply been a reality for the last 500 years with the same logic of sacrifice zones and people, and we're simply seeing a continuation from colonialism to imperialism to neoliberalism, and as those forces ravage the planet more and more, the contradictions within it become greater and greater. And and I think there are very, very many different views. But I would much rather actually think about, in every moment, even the last century, where there has been a moment of war, there has also been incredible movements of people that have come up, and people who have connected struggles and frames. Whether it's Martin Luther King, who talked about that you cannot have racial justice and civil liberties without an end to militarism, or whether it's going back to the First World War and people understanding that we needed to rebuild solidarity between peoples, even as the elites want to go to war with each other. And this moment of crisis, I think, is interesting because we are now more connected than we've ever been before. And that throws up a possibility of solidarity between peoples, because it's ordinary people who will never benefit from any kind of war. So I take more from, that famous quote from Gramsci where he says, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And of course there is the time of monsters. But in every fairy story, there are also people who slay those monsters. And that, I think, is us. So I don't see these as being static or inevitable. I think they're a question about power. And that question about power comes back also to the power of us as movements. And that's why, we have to understand why we've seen a global worldwide repression of protests, of action, both in this country and globally, because they understand that in these moments of tension, we will, and we are building movements that break our silos and create a much broader sense of people, that the actions of our politicians don't speak in the name of us. So I don't think it's inevitable. I think, all history is shaped by actors, and we are not passive. We have agency, and we have to prevent it.
Thank you very much, Asad. We are out of time,